The wind whipped across the skyscraper's roof, drowning out the billionaire's cruel laughter. Catherine Hale, a ruthless CEO, backed into a corner, pointed at a man in a stained jumpsuit, holding a mop. "If he can fly this chopper off this roof right now, I'll marry him instead of you." It was supposed to be a sarcastic joke to crush an arrogant suitor. But the janitor didn't laugh. He dropped his mop, stepped into the $6 million machine, and hit the ignition. David Hayes existed in the margins of the world. At 32, his life was measured, not in years, but in the agonizingly slow ticking of the clock during his night shifts, and the terrifyingly fast beep of a heart monitor during the day. David was a janitor at Hale Aerospace, a multi-billion-dollar defense and aviation contractor, headquartered in the glittering skyline of downtown Seattle. Every night from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., he emptied trash cans filled with discarded blueprints, scrubbed marble floors that cost more than he would earn in a lifetime, and polished the glass walls of the executive suites. He was invisible, and that was exactly how he needed it to be. 5 years ago, David wasn't holding a mop. He was holding the cyclic of a Sikorsky UH-60 Black Hawk. As a Chief Warrant Officer 3 in the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the legendary Night Stalkers, David was one of the most elite rotary wing pilots on the planet. He had flown classified extractions in pitch-black valleys in the Middle East and navigated catastrophic mechanical failures over hostile waters. But the military didn't care about personal tragedies. And when his wife died of an aggressive leukemia, leaving him with a 2-year-old daughter named Chloe, David made the only choice he could. He walked away from the sky to be a father. Now 7-year-old Chloe was in a bed at Seattle Children's Hospital, fighting a severe congenital heart defect. The surgeries were mounting. The insurance from his low-level custodial job barely scratched the surface. The hospital billing department was threatening to discharge her from the specialized care unit. David was drowning in over $200,000 of medical debt. He was a man pushed to the absolute brink, functioning on 3 hours of sleep, fueled entirely by the desperate love for his little girl. 70 floors above the Seattle streets, in a world completely detached from David's brutal reality, sat Catherine Hale. At 34, Catherine was the CEO of Hale Aerospace, having inherited the empire after her father's sudden, scandal-ridden death a year prior. Catherine was brilliant, icy, and utterly isolated. The media dubbed her the Titanium Heiress, a moniker she leaned into to survive the boardroom bloodbaths. The company's board of directors, a group of aging conservative billionaires, despised answering to a young, unmarried woman. They cited this company's dipping stock, a direct result of her late father's embezzlement scandals, and relentlessly pressured her to step down, or at the very least, stabilize her public image by marrying someone with heavy industry ties. Enter Bradley Stanton. Bradley was the 38-year-old heir to Stanton Capital, an aggressive private equity firm holding a massive chunk of Hale Aerospace's debt. Bradley was the epitome of inherited arrogance, a man who wore bespoke Tom Ford suits, drove a Bugatti Chiron, and treated people like disposable assets. The board wanted Catherine to marry Bradley. It would merge their assets, erase the debt, and install a strong male figure in the public eye. Bradley had been cornering her for months, his proposals less about romance and more about hostile takeovers. "You're running out of time, Kath," Bradley would sneer during their closed-door meetings. "The stock is down 12% this quarter. The Department of Defense is stalling on the new drone contract because they don't trust a little girl to deliver. Marry me. We announce it at the annual gala. It fixes everything." Catherine hated him. She hated his entitlement, the way he looked at her like a prize horse, and the terrifying reality that he was right about the company's precarious position. If she didn't secure a PR miracle or a massive injection of capital soon, the board would force a vote of no confidence. She would lose the legacy her grandfather built. On the night of the annual Hale Aerospace Charity Gala, the tension finally snapped. The gala was held on the top floor of the Hale Tower, spilling out onto the massive, wind-swept helipad overlooking the Puget Sound. Inside, the room was a sea of black tuxedos, diamonds, and forced smiles. David was supposed to be off that night, but a supervisor had offered him double time to work the event as a discreet cleanup crew. He needed the money for Chloe's upcoming echocardiogram. Dressed in a drab gray jumpsuit that stood out starkly against the velvet and silk of the guests, David was quietly wiping up a spilled glass of Bollinger champagne near the heavy glass doors leading out to the helipad. Outside, bathed in the red warning lights of the skyscraper, sat the company's crown jewel. A brand new, $6 million Augusta Westland AW-139 VIP helicopter. It was a mechanical masterpiece, equipped with Pratt & Whitney engines, capable of cruising at nearly 200 miles an hour. David paused his wiping for a fraction of a second, his eyes locking onto the sleek fuselage. He knew that machine. He had read the technical manuals out of pure, painful nostalgia during his breaks. He missed the smell of jet fuel. He missed the vibration of the rotors in his chest. His reverie was shattered by the sound of high heels clicking furiously against the pavement, followed by the heavy, aggressive strides of Bradley Stanton. "Stop walking away from me, Catherine!" Bradley's voice cut through the howling wind, sharp and commanding. Catherine spun around, her emerald green evening gown whipping around her legs. Her face was pale with fury. "I told you inside, Bradley. The answer is no. I am not signing the merger agreement, and I am certainly not wearing your ring." David, caught in the shadows just inside the glass doors, froze. The golden rule of the custodial staff was to remain unseen, especially during executive disputes. He lowered his head, focusing intently on the marble floor, but the door was cracked open. He could hear every word. "You are out of options," Bradley sneered, closing the distance between them until he was looming over her, near the landing skids of the AW-139. "The board meets on Monday. They have the votes, Catherine. You're finished, unless you walk back in there with me, announce our engagement, and let Stanton Capital restructure the debt. You will be stripped of your title by Tuesday morning." Catherine's fists clenched. She was trapped. She knew the votes were real. The old men in the boardroom had finally orchestrated her demise. "I would rather lose the company than let a parasite like you dismantle it," she hissed. Bradley let out a dark, condescending laugh. "Please, you're a pampered princess who doesn't know how to lose. You have no one else. No allies, no secret investors. Who are you going to marry to save your image? One of your sycophant VPs. They're all too scared of me." Bradley cast a disdainful look around, his eyes suddenly catching the movement in the shadows. He spotted David. Bradley's lips curled into a cruel, mocking sneer. "Or maybe him," Bradley laughed, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at David, who was standing quietly with his mop bucket. "Is that your backup plan, Kath? The guy cleaning up our spilled drinks?" Catherine blinked, thrown off balance by the sudden inclusion of the janitor. She looked over at David. He was tall, his face obscured by the dim light, his posture rigid. Bradley walked over, kicking David's yellow caution sign out of the way. "Hey, cleanup boy! You make what, $15 an hour? How'd you like to be the CEO of Hale Aerospace? All you have to do is marry the Ice Queen here. I'm sure you could use the upgrade from scrubbing toilets." David didn't flinch. He didn't look at Bradley. He just gripped the handle of his mop tighter, his knuckles turning white. He thought of Chloe, lying in a hospital bed a few miles away, her chest scarred from surgeries. He didn't have time for the ego trips of billionaires. "Leave him out of this, Bradley!" Catherine snapped, stepping forward. The sheer audacity of Bradley's cruelty sparked something reckless and volatile inside her. The pressure of the last 12 months, the grief of losing her father, the relentless sexism of the board. It all boiled over. "Why not?" Bradley mocked, leaning against the side of the multi-million-dollar helicopter. "You said you'd rather marry anyone else. Prove it. Show me just how little this company means to you." Catherine's eyes flashed with manic defiance. She looked at the smirking Bradley, then at the silent Janitor, and finally at the Augusta Westland AW-139. She was going down anyway. If Monday was her execution, she was going to make tonight a spectacle Bradley would never forget. "You know what, Bradley?" Catherine's voice was lethal, carrying over the wind. "I would." Bradley stopped smiling. "You're psychotic." "I'd rather marry him," Catherine said, her voice rising, stepping toward David. "In fact, I'll make a deal right now. If this man, this janitor you just mocked, can get in that helicopter and fly it off this roof, I will marry him. I'll sign over half my personal shares to him. I'll make him a multimillionaire tonight." It was a bluff, a chaotic, desperate bluff meant to insult Bradley's pride by elevating the lowest-ranking employee in the building above him. The AW-139 was a highly complex twin-engine aircraft. To a civilian, the cockpit was an incomprehensible sea of glass displays, switches, and toggles. A mistake during the startup sequence could cause an engine fire. Bradley burst into laughter. "You're pathetic, Catherine. You're throwing a tantrum. Go ahead, clean-up boy. The lady made you an offer. Go fly the $6 million chopper. Let's see you turn on the battery." Silence hung heavily on the helipad, broken only by the wind. David stood perfectly still. His mind raced. Half her personal shares, millions of dollars. It was an absurd, impossible, chaotic corporate stunt born of rage. But for David, it was the exact cost of Chloe's life. It was top-tier surgeons. It was a new heart. It was everything. Slowly, deliberately, David let go of the mop. It clattered loudly onto the marble floor. He unzipped the top half of his gray janitorial jumpsuit, tying the sleeves around his waist to reveal a plain black t-shirt underneath. He stepped out of the shadows, his face finally catching the red light of the helipad. His eyes were cold, calculating, and completely devoid of fear. Bradley's laughter died in his throat. David walked past Bradley, not even acknowledging his existence, and approached Catherine. He looked down at her. "You have witnesses to that offer, Ms. Hale." Catherine froze, her breath catching. The man's eyes were intense, carrying a weight and authority that completely contradicted his uniform. She stammered, suddenly realizing the gravity of her reckless words. "I don't—" "Are you backing out?" David asked, his voice a low, even baritone that commanded the space. Bradley scoffed nervously. "He's bluffing. The guy cleans toilets. If he touches that door, I'm calling security." David didn't wait for Catherine's answer. He turned, grabbed the handle of the AW-139's pilot door, unlatched it, and swung it open. He climbed into the right seat, the pilot in command seat. The cockpit was dark, a silent tomb of composite materials and expensive leather. David sank into the seat, and for the first time in 5 years he felt his body align with its true purpose. The muscle memory, dormant but never dead, awoke with violent clarity. Outside, Bradley was screaming at a security guard who had just stepped onto the roof. "Pull him out of there! He's going to damage the aircraft!" Catherine stood rooted to the spot, her heart hammering against her ribs. What had she done? Inside the cockpit, David's hands moved with terrifying speed and precision. He didn't hesitate. He didn't search for switches. The battery switch to on. The glass cockpit flared to life, illuminating David's face in a ghostly green and blue glow. "Avionics Master, switch to on." Fuel pumps, ones 1 and 2 to on. The high-pitched whine of the electrical system spinning up pierced the night air. Outside, the security guard stopped dead in his tracks, realizing the machine was actually coming alive. Bradley took a step back, his face draining of color. How the hell is he doing that? Engine 1 mode switch to idle. The quiet whine transformed into a deep mechanical roar as the first Pratt & Whitney engine caught fire. The massive main rotor blades above them groaned, slowly beginning to turn, slicing through the night air. Thwump, thwump, thaw, thwump. David's eyes scanned the engine parameters on the MFD multifunction display. Oil pressure, green. Turbine temperature, nominal. Butche engine 2 mode, switch to idle. The second engine roared to life. The rotor RPM accelerated rapidly, the slow thwump blurring into a deafening continuous roar. The wind on the helipad intensified into a hurricane, whipping Catherine's hair violently around her face. She shielded her eyes, stumbling back a step, staring in absolute shock at the man in the cockpit. He wasn't panicking. He wasn't guessing. He was performing a textbook, expedited startup sequence. David reached up and flicked the anti-collision lights. Brilliant strobes began flashing, casting rapid-fire shadows across the helipad. He grabbed the headset hanging on the hook, slipped it over his ears, and adjusted the mic. He flipped the radio to the local air traffic control tower frequency. Boeing Tower, this is helicopter November 70 Hale. Requesting immediate VFR clearance for departure from Hale Tower roof to the south. The radio crackled in his ear. November 70 Hale, Boeing Tower. Clearance granted. Maintain VFR, squawk 1200. Safe flight. David dropped his hand to the collective lever by his left thigh, his right hand wrapped around the cyclic stick between his knees. His feet rested perfectly on the anti-torque pedals. The machine was purring, practically begging to be unleashed. He looked out the side window. Bradley was huddled near the stairwell door, covering his ears, his expensive suit violently ruffled by the rotor wash, looking small and terrified. Catherine was still standing near the edge of the safety circle, refusing to look away. Despite the chaotic wind and the deafening noise, she was staring directly into David's eyes through the cockpit glass. David gave her a single sharp nod. He smoothly pulled up on the collective. The $6 million machine severed its connection with the earth. It didn't jerk. It didn't wobble. It lifted off the roof with the buttery grace of a veteran pilot. David brought it up into a 10-foot hover, the skids dangling just above the H painted on the concrete. He hovered there for 3 seconds, letting Bradley and Catherine fully comprehend the impossible reality of the moment. Then, with a slight push of the cyclic, David pitched the nose down and pushed the collective. The Augusta Westland AW-139 shot off the edge of the 70-story skyscraper, plunging into the darkness of the Seattle skyline. Inside the cockpit, David felt the familiar G-force press him into his seat. The city lights became a blur of gold and white beneath him. He banked sharply out over the black expanse of the Puget Sound, the reflection of the moon scattering across the water. For the first time in 5 years, David Hayes could breathe. But as the adrenaline began to level out, the reality of what he had just done crashed down on him. He had just stolen the CEO's helicopter. He was flying a multi-million-dollar corporate aircraft with no flight plan filed with his employer, wearing a half-stripped janitor's uniform. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his cheap, cracked cell phone. He dialed a number from memory. Seattle Children's Hospital, Pediatric ICU, a tired nurse answered. "It's David Hayes," he said over the hum of the headset. "How is she?" "She's sleeping, David. Her vitals are stable for now, but the billing department called again. They need to speak with you tomorrow." David looked out at the sprawling, wealthy city below him. He thought of the Ice Queen CEO standing on the roof and the legally binding verbal contract she had screamed over the wind in front of witnesses. "Tell them," David said, his voice hard as steel, "that the bill is going to be paid in full by tomorrow afternoon. Tell them Chloe isn't going anywhere." He banked the helicopter back toward the city. He wasn't going to run. He was going to fly this machine right back to the Hale Tower, land it perfectly on the H, and collect exactly what Catherine Hale owed him. The Augusta Westland AW-139 carved a tight, aggressive arc over the Puget Sound before banking back towards the glowing monolith of the Hale Tower. Inside the cockpit, David Hayes was a machine of cold calculation. The 20-minute flight had purged the exhaustion from his bones, replacing it with the sharp crystalline focus he used to rely on when dodging anti-aircraft fire over the Hindu Kush. He lined up the approach, his hands and feet dancing in perfect subconscious harmony with the flight controls. On the roof, the scene was pure chaos. Security personnel had flooded the helipad. Bradley Stanton was pacing furiously, screaming into his cell phone, demanding the FAA scramble jets to shoot down the stolen aircraft. Catherine Hale stood exactly where David had left her, her emerald gown snapping in the wind, her eyes fixed on the blinking strobes growing larger against the night sky. The helicopter descended with terrifying speed, then flared aggressively, just 20 feet above the deck, bleeding off its forward momentum in a maneuver that would have made a seasoned test pilot sweat. The rotor wash hit the roof like a physical blow, sending security guards scrambling backward. David set the $6 million machine down on the painted H so gently that the landing skids barely made a sound against the concrete. He didn't immediately kill the engines. He let the rotors spin at a deafening idle, a massive mechanical beast straining against its leash. David opened his door and stepped out onto the windswept roof. He still wore the bottom half of his janitorial jumpsuit, his black t-shirt clinging to his chest. He looked past the half-dozen security guards who had their hands hovering nervously near their holstered weapons. He looked directly at Bradley Stanton. "Is this the part where you call the police, Stanton?" David's voice projected effortlessly over the roar of the engines. Bradley's face was purple with rage. He pointed a trembling finger at David. "You're going to federal prison, you piece of trash. Grand theft aviation, reckless endangerment." "Actually," Catherine's voice sliced through the noise. She stepped forward, her posture rigid, her chin high. The titanium heiress had returned. "He was conducting a spontaneous readiness test of our executive transport protocols. Authorized by me." Bradley spun to face her, his eyes bulging. "Are you out of your mind, Catherine? He's the janitor. He scrubbed the toilets on the 42nd floor 2 hours ago." "And now," Catherine said, her voice dropping into a lethal, icy register, "he is my fiancé." "Heard the deal, Bradley. You mocked him. You mocked me. I made an offer, and he delivered. Now get off my roof." "You can't be serious," Bradley stammered, looking between the two of them. He laughed, but it was a thin, hysterical sound. "The board will crucify you on Monday. You're marrying a toilet scrubber to spite me. This is corporate suicide." "I said, get off my roof," Catherine commanded, gesturing to her head of security. "Escort Mr. Stanton to the elevators. If he resists, physically remove him from the premises." Bradley straightened his bespoke suit, his face contorting into a mask of pure venom. "You're dead." "Dead, Catherine. By Tuesday morning, I'll own this company, and I'll fire both of you myself." He turned and stormed toward the stairwell, the security team trailing closely behind him. Once the heavy metal door slammed shut, the roof descended into an uneasy quiet, save for the idling helicopter. Catherine turned to David. The adrenaline of her bluff was fading, leaving behind the terrifying reality of what she had just committed to. David walked over to the cockpit, reached in, and initiated the shutdown sequence. As the engines died and the rotors began their slow, sweeping deceleration, the silence between them grew heavy. "Walk with me," Catherine said, her voice tight. She led him away from the security detail, toward the edge of the roof overlooking the city. The wind was brutal, but neither of them shivered. "I don't know who you are or how you learned to fly like that," Catherine began, not looking at him, her eyes fixed on the Seattle skyline. "But you realize what just happened, don't you? That was a public declaration. Bradley will leak this to the press by morning to make me look insane. If I back out now, he proves to the board that I'm erratic and unfit to lead. So don't back out," David said flatly. Catherine finally turned to look at him. She was expecting a bewildered employee, someone she could pay off to disappear. Instead, she found a man whose eyes held a dark, unshakable gravity. "You want to go through with this? A legal marriage. You understand I don't actually intend to hand over half my personal shares of a multi-billion-dollar company to a stranger." "I don't want your company, Ms. Hale," David replied, leaning against the cold glass of the guardrail. "I have a 7-year-old daughter named Chloe. She's at Seattle Children's Hospital. She needs a specialized cardiac surgery that my insurance won't cover, and she needs it by next month. The hospital billing department is threatening to stop her care because I owe them $240,000. Catherine's breath hitched. The hardened CEO facade cracked for a fraction of a second. She had anticipated greed. She hadn't anticipated raw, desperate survival. "Here are my terms," David continued, his voice devoid of emotion. "You pay off her medical debt by noon tomorrow. You put her on the executive platinum health plan. You set up a trust fund of $5 million for her future. In exchange, I will sign whatever ironclad prenuptial agreement your lawyers draft. I will play the devoted, brilliant fiancé. I will stand by you at the board meeting on Monday and help you crush Stanton. You get to keep your empire. I get to keep my daughter." Catherine stared at him. He wasn't negotiating. He was stating facts. "You think $5 million and $250,000 medical bill is a fair trade for a fake marriage, given that your alternative is losing Hale Aerospace entirely to a man who treats you like property?" David held her gaze. "I think you're getting a discount." Catherine searched his face for any sign of bluffing. There was none. She extended a cold, manicured hand. "Be in my private office at 7 a.m. sharp. We have a lot of work to do before Monday." David looked at her hand, then met her eyes. "Deal." The executive suites of Hale Aerospace were a masterclass in intimidation. Floor-to-ceiling windows, imported Italian marble, and original Rothko paintings designed to make visitors feel small. At 7:02 a.m. on Saturday, David Hayes sat in a buttery leather chair in Catherine's office, looking entirely out of place in his faded jeans and a plain gray Henley. Across the massive mahogany desk sat Catherine, looking immaculate in a tailored white pantsuit, and Jonathan Cole, Hale Aerospace's ruthless chief legal counsel. Cole was a man who looked like he chewed glass for breakfast. He was currently staring at a manila folder with an expression of profound shock. "Are you absolutely certain about this, Catherine?" Cole asked, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "This isn't just a PR stunt. A marriage certificate is a legally binding vulnerability." "I am aware of what a marriage is, Jonathan," Catherine said briskly, sipping her black coffee. "Read the file." Cole cleared his throat, looking at David as if seeing a ghost. "David Hayes, formerly Chief Warrant Officer 3, 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. The Night Stalkers, 3 tours in Afghanistan, 2 in Syria. Distinguished Flying Cross, Silver Star, Purple Heart. Honorably discharged 5 years ago following the death of his spouse." Cole closed the folder, his arrogance entirely replaced by bewilderment. You were one of the deadliest helicopter pilots on Earth. Why the hell are you emptying trash cans in my building? It pays the rent and gives me a schedule where I can spend the days at the hospital with my daughter, David answered simply. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. Catherine looked at David, a new layer of realization washing over her. She hadn't just hired as janitor who happened to know how to fly. She had accidentally enlisted a highly decorated war hero. The PR implications were staggering. It was the perfect narrative. The agreement is simple, Cole said, sliding a thick stack of papers across the desk.
Be legally married to Ms. Hale for a minimum of 18 months. You will cohabitate in her penthouse to satisfy any media or board scrutiny. You will make public appearances. You will never, under any circumstances, disclose the transactional nature of this union. If you breach this NDA, we will sue you into the Stone Age.
David didn't even look at the terrifying penalty clauses. He flipped directly to the compensation section. And Chloe's medical bills. Paid in full via wire transfer at 8:02 a.m. this morning, Catherine interjected, sliding a bank receipt across the desk. She is currently being moved to the VIP pediatric suite, and her surgeon is scheduled for Monday afternoon. The $5 million will be held in escrow, released to a trust in her name upon the dissolution of the marriage. David stared at the wire transfer receipt. For the first time in 5 years, the crushing, suffocating weight on his chest lifted. He picked up the heavy Mont Blanc pen and signed his name on the dotted lines without a second thought. Good, Catherine said, standing up. Now we have 48 hours to turn you into a man the board will believe I fell in love with. The next 2 days were a grueling gauntlet. Catherine brought in a discreet, high-end styling team. David was subjected to haircuts, grooming, and fittings for custom Brioni and Tom Ford suits that cost more than his annual salary. He endured it with the stoic patience of a soldier undergoing a miserable training exercise. On Sunday evening, the transformation was complete. David stood in the dressing room of Catherine's sprawling downtown penthouse. He wore a charcoal gray three-piece suit, perfectly tailored to his broad athletic frame. The unruly stubble was gone, replaced by a sharp, clean jawline. His dark hair was styled impeccably. He looked lethal, wealthy, and undeniably commanding. Catherine walked into the room and stopped dead in her tracks. The breath caught in her throat. The man standing before her didn't look like a prop or a fake husband. He looked like a man who owned the city. "Will this work?" David asked, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt, catching her staring in the mirror. Catherine quickly composed herself, clearing her throat. "It will suffice. But looking the part is only half the battle. Tomorrow at 9 a.m. the board is going to try to execute me. Bradley will have told them about the helipad stunt. They are going to demand my resignation, citing erratic behavior. You have to be perfect. You have to be the stabilizing force they think I need." "I know how to handle hostile environments," David said quietly. He turned to face her. "But you need to trust me. When we walk in there, I am taking the lead. You are the CEO, but I am the shield. Let them attack me." Catherine hesitated. She was used to fighting alone, clawing for every inch of respect. "Bradley is vicious. He has dirt on everyone. He will try to humiliate you." "Let him try," David said, a dangerous cold smile playing on his lips. "I've dealt with warlords, Mrs. Hale. A private equity brat doesn't scare me." Monday morning, the atmosphere in the Hale Aerospace executive boardroom was thick with tension and the smell of expensive cologne. Around the massive, polished oak table sat 12 of the most powerful corporate figures in the country. At the far end of the table sat Gregory Pierce, the chairman of the board, a ruthless septuagenarian who had never hidden his disdain for Catherine. And standing near the window, looking like a cat who had cornered a mouse, was Bradley Stanton. "It's 9:05, Bradley announced, checking his Patek Philippe watch. "She's late. Typical. I think we all know why we're here today, gentlemen. The spectacle on the helipad Friday night was the final straw. Catherine Hale has lost her mind, and she is taking this company down with her. I motion for an immediate vote of no confidence. Seconded, mumbled a board member. The heavy double doors of the boardroom suddenly swung open. The room fell dead silent. Catherine Hale walked in. She was radiating an aura of absolute untouchable power, dressed in a sleek, dark navy suit. But it wasn't Catherine who sucked the air out of the room. It was the man walking half a step behind her. David Hayes moved with the silent, predatory grace of an apex predator. The charcoal Brioni suit fit him like armor. His eyes swept the room, cataloging every face, every exit, assessing the threats with military precision. He pulled out Catherine's chair for her at the head of the table, waited for her to sit, and then stood imposing and perfectly still, right behind her right shoulder. Bradley Stanton's smug smile vanished. He stared at David, his jaw practically hitting the floor. The janitor he had mocked 3 nights ago now looked like a billionaire tech mogul who could break his neck with 2 fingers. "Good morning, gentlemen," Catherine said, her voice smooth as silk. "Apologies for the delay. We were finalizing some paperwork." "What is the meaning of this, Catherine?" Chairman Pierce barked, glaring at David. "Who is this man? And why is he in a closed-door executive session?" "This," Bradley interrupted, his voice shrill with panicked outrage, "is the janitor. I told you. She pulled him off the night shift on Friday and had him fly the AW-139. He's a toilet scrubber. She's trying to pass him off as a suitor to stall the merger." Murmurs of shock and outrage rippled around the table. Pierce slammed his hand on the wood. "Catherine, if this is a joke, you are terminated immediately. Security." "There is no need for security, Gregory," Catherine said calmly. She looked up at David. It was his flaw. David stepped forward. He didn't raise his voice, but the sheer dense weight of his presence commanded absolute silence. "My name is David Hayes, and as of 8 a.m. this morning, I am Catherine Hale's legal husband and the primary beneficiary of her personal estate." The boardroom erupted. Bradley was practically hyperventilating. "It's a sham! He's a fraud! Ask him how much he makes an hour!" David ignored Bradley completely. He walked to the center of the table and placed a thick black leather folder on the wood. He slid it toward Chairman Pierce. "You are currently facing a crisis with the Department of Defense," David said, his voice a low rumble that echoed off the glass walls. "The Pentagon is threatening to pull the multi-billion-dollar contract for the new MQ next-generation tactical drone. Stanton Capital over here." David finally cast a dismissive, freezing glance at Bradley. "Has convinced you that the DoD lacks faith in Catherine's leadership. That is a lie." Bradley turned red. "Shut up! You know nothing about defense contracting." "I know," David continued, turning his back on Bradley, an ultimate sign of disrespect, "that the DoD is stalling because the propulsion system Stanton Capital insisted on retrofitting into the drone to cut costs is causing a critical latency in the pitch control software." The board members froze. This was highly classified internal engineering data. "How the hell do you know that?" Pierce demanded. "Because for the last year I've been reading your engineers' discarded blueprints out of the trash cans at 3 a.m., David said without a hint of shame. "And because before I took a job keeping my hours flexible for my sick daughter, I was flying highly classified rotary and fixed-wing assets for the 160th SOAR. I've flown the hardware you're trying to build. I know General William Hackett, the man currently holding up your contract personally. I flew him out of a hot zone in Helmand Province in 2021. The silence in the room was so absolute, you could hear the hum of the air conditioning. Bradley Stanton looked like he had been struck by lightning. Stanton's cost-cutting measures are going to get American soldiers killed, David said, leaning over the table, his eyes locking onto Pierce. General Hackett knows it. That's why he won't sign. But at 7:30 this morning, my wife and I had a conference call with the general. Catherine agreed to scrap Stanton's faulty propulsion system and revert to the original Hale engineering specs. General Hackett has verbally agreed to sign the contract by close of business today on the condition that I remain on as a special executive consultant for military asset development. David tapped the black folder in front of Pierce. The term sheet is in there, signed by the Pentagon. Chairman Pierce slowly opened the folder. His eyes scanned the document, widening with every line. It was real. The multi-billion-dollar contract that was going to save the company was secured. Not by Bradley Stanton, by the man standing in front of him. David stepped back, returning to his position behind Catherine's chair. So, gentlemen, I suggest you take Mr. Stanton's motion for a vote of no confidence, and you throw it in the trash. I can tell you exactly which bin to use. Bradley was shaking. His entire corporate coup, months in the making, had been dismantled in less than 5 minutes by a man he had treated like dirt. This is a trick. I own your debt. I can still crush you. Catherine finally smiled. It was a terrifying, predatory smile. Actually, Bradley, since the DoD contract is now secured, our stock is going to skyrocket by tomorrow morning. We will be exercising the buyout clause on your debt at market open. Hale Aerospace no longer needs Stanton Capital, and I certainly don't need you. She leaned forward. Now get out of my boardroom. Bradley looked around the table, desperately seeking an ally. But the old men were staring at the DoD contract, calculating the massive profits. He was entirely alone. Defeated, humiliated, and outplayed, Bradley Stanton turned and practically ran out of the room. Chairman Pierce closed the folder. He looked at Catherine, then at David. The disdain was gone, replaced by a begrudging, shocked respect. Well, Catherine, Pierce said, clearing his throat. It seems congratulations on your nuptials are in order. Catherine didn't flinch. She just nodded smoothly. But beneath the table, out of sight of the board, her hand was trembling from the pure adrenaline of the victory. Suddenly, she felt a warm, strong hand gently cover hers. She looked up at David. He was staring straight ahead, his face an unreadable mask for the board. But the grip on her hand was a silent, grounding anchor. In a world of corporate sharks, the janitor she had hired as a fake husband had just become the most dangerous man in the room. And he was entirely on her side. The media fallout from the Monday morning boardroom massacre was instantaneous and explosive. By noon, the financial news networks were scrambling to cover the story of the decade. Catherine Hale, the titanium heiress, had married a literal war hero who had been hiding in plain sight on her custodial staff. The press dug frantically into David Hayes's background, only to hit a solid brick wall of Department of Defense redactions. The mystery only fueled the fire. Hale Aerospace stock didn't just stabilize, it soared, closing up 18% by the end of the week. But inside the sprawling 12,000-square-foot penthouse overlooking Elliott Bay, the triumphant billionaire and the decorated pilot lived in a state of carefully choreographed avoidance. Their marriage was a masterpiece of corporate theater, but behind the biometric locks of Catherine's front door, they were two strangers trapped in an ironclad contract. David had moved his few belongings into a guest suite on the opposite wing of the penthouse. They communicated mostly through Catherine's executive assistant regarding public appearances, charity dinners, and press photo ops. Yet, the silence of the massive apartment was heavy with an unspoken shift in power. Catherine had spent her entire life surrounded by men who wanted to manipulate, control, or diminish her. David simply existed in her space without demanding anything. He woke up at 4:30 a.m. every day, ran 10 miles along the Seattle waterfront, and spent the rest of his waking hours at Seattle Children's Hospital with Chloe. He never asked for access to her accounts, never inquired about her assets, and never tried to leverage his new status. He was the most dangerous man she had ever met, yet he was the only one who made her feel entirely safe. The true test of their arrangement came 2 weeks later. It was a Tuesday, the day of Chloe's open-heart surgery. Dr. Philip Granger, the chief of pediatric cardiothoracic surgery, had scheduled the complex valve reconstruction for 8 a.m. It was an 8-hour procedure with severe risks. David sat alone in the sterile, fluorescent-lit surgical waiting room. The immaculate Tom Ford suits were gone, replaced by a faded gray hooded sweatshirt and jeans. He was no longer the imposing executive consultant. He was just a terrified father staring blindly at a styrofoam cup of black coffee. The steady hands that had successfully guided crippled helicopters through zero-visibility sandstorms were now trembling slightly. At 11:30 a.m., the heavy wooden doors of the waiting room pushed open. David didn't look up, assuming it was a nurse, but the scent of expensive bergamot and cedar caught his attention. He raised his head. Catherine Hale stood there dressed in a sharp charcoal trench coat, holding 2 large paper cups from a high-end local roaster and a white paper bag that smelled faintly of warm pastries. She looked entirely out of place in the grim emotional purgatory of a hospital waiting area. She had a multi-billion-dollar supply chain crisis to manage and 3 congressional lobbying meetings on her calendar. "The coffee from the cafeteria here tastes like battery acid," Catherine said softly, walking over and sitting in the cheap plastic chair next to him. She handed him one of the cups. Colombian dark roast, black. David took the cup, his fingers brushing against hers. The warmth of the coffee seeped into his cold hands. "You're supposed to be in a meeting with the Federal Aviation Administration right now." "I rescheduled," Catherine replied, looking straight ahead at the muted television mounted on the wall. "My husband's daughter is in surgery. It wouldn't play well with the press if I wasn't here." David looked at her. He saw the faint exhaustion under her eyes, the microscopic crack in her titanium armor. "There are no cameras here, Catherine. The press doesn't know." Catherine finally turned to look at him. For a moment, the CEO vanished. She was just a woman who had realized how incredibly lonely she had been before this quiet, intense man crashed into her life. "I know," she said quietly. "I didn't come for the press, David." They sat in silence for the next 4 hours. They didn't talk about stock prices, Bradley Stanton, or drone prototypes. David talked about Chloe. He talked about her obsession with the stars, how she wanted to be an astrophysicist, and the way her laugh sounded like a hiccup when she found something truly funny. Catherine listened, her heart aching with a strange, foreign warmth. She had grown up with a father who viewed her as a corporate succession plan, not a daughter. Hearing a man speak about a child with such fierce, unconditional devotion shattered the remaining walls around her heart. At 4:45 p.m., Dr. Granger walked through the double doors wearing blue scrubs, pulling off his surgical cap. He looked exhausted but smiling. David stood up so fast his chair scraped loudly against the linoleum. "She did beautifully, David," Dr. Granger said, clapping a hand on his shoulder. "The valve reconstruction is holding perfectly. Her vitals are strong. She's going to be in the ICU for a few days for observation, but the hardest part is over. She's going to have a normal, healthy life." The breath David had been holding for the last 2 years left his lungs in a ragged, shuddering exhale. He dropped his face into his hands, leaning against the wall, overwhelmed by the crushing wave of relief. Catherine didn't think. She just moved. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around his waist, pressing her face against his chest. It wasn't a PR stunt. It wasn't a calculated move. It was pure human instinct. David stiffened for a fraction of a second, entirely unaccustomed to physical comfort. Then slowly, his massive arms wrapped around her shoulders, pulling her tight against him. He buried his face in her hair, breathing in the scent of her perfume. In that sterile hospital hallway, the invisible boundary of their contract dissolved. The fake marriage was over. Whatever this was now, it was real. 3 months later, the world had fundamentally shifted. Chloe had been discharged from the hospital and moved into the penthouse. The cavernous, silent apartment was suddenly filled with the sounds of cartoons, scattered crayons, and the bright, infectious laughter of a healthy 7-year-old girl. Catherine, to the absolute shock of her board of directors, had rearranged her entire life around the child. She was leaving the office at 5 p.m. instead of midnight. She was reading bedtime stories. She was learning how to braid hair. And she was falling, desperately, irrevocably, in love with David. Their dynamic had evolved into a seamless, unspoken partnership. David was no longer just a figurehead. As the special executive consultant, he was brutally efficient at streamlining Hale Aerospace's defense manufacturing. He rooted out bureaucratic waste and earned the fierce loyalty of the engineering teams. But despite the domestic peace and corporate stability, a dark storm was brewing just beneath the surface. Bradley Stanton had not simply faded away. Humiliated and ousted, Bradley had retreated to the shadows, consumed by a venomous need for revenge. His private equity firm had taken a massive hit, and his reputation in the financial sector was ruined. He couldn't attack Catherine legally or financially anymore, so he decided to attack the very thing keeping Hale Aerospace afloat, the MQ Next drone contract. The Department of Defense required one final, live fire and maneuverability demonstration of the MQ Next prototype before officially releasing the multi-billion-dollar funds. The test was scheduled for a bleak, overcast Thursday at the Yakima Training Center, a massive military proving ground in the high desert of central Washington. General William Hackett and a cohort of Pentagon brass were seated in an elevated, reinforced glass observation bunker. Catherine stood at the front of the bunker, radiating professional confidence, while David stood beside her, his eyes scanning the arid landscape. 2 miles out, sitting on a concrete tarmac, was the MQ Next. It was a terrifying piece of machinery, a sleek, swept-wing autonomous drone the size of a fighter jet, carrying a payload of inert, concrete-filled, Hellfire dummy missiles for the weight test. Inside the Hale Aerospace Mobile Command Center, parked 50 yards from the bunker, the lead software engineer, Derek Larch, sat sweating profusely at his terminal. 3 weeks prior, a shell corporation linked to Stanton had wired $3 million to Larch's offshore account. All Larch had to do was insert a highly encrypted logic bomb into the drone's telemetry receiver, a piece of code designed to trigger an unrecoverable avionics failure mid-flight, causing the drone to crash spectacularly in front of the Pentagon brass. Hale Aerospace's stock would tank to zero, and Stanton could buy the ashes for pennies. "Command, this is Tower. You are clear for launch sequence," the radio crackled. Catherine nodded to the flight director. "Initiate launch." 2 miles away, the MQ Next's jet engines screamed to life, kicking up a massive cloud of desert dust. The drone shot down the runway and pitched violently into the sky, climbing at a breathtaking angle. It was a flawless takeoff. For the first 20 minutes, the drone executed complex high-G maneuvers, banking, rolling, and simulating target tracking with terrifying precision. General Hackett was nodding in approval. Catherine allowed herself a small smile. Then the logic bomb detonated. Inside the command center, the telemetry screens flashed a violent, blinding red. "Warning. Telemetry link lost. Warning. Pitch control override." What the hell is happening?" the flight director screamed. his hands flying across the keyboard. "I've a lost link. The drone is not responding to inputs." In the observation bunker, the atmosphere instantly vaporized from triumphant to terrified. The massive drone, flying at 400 miles an hour, suddenly leveled out and banked sharply. It wasn't crashing into the empty deck as Larch had intended. The code had triggered a fail-safe loop that locked the rudders and elevators. "Catherine." David's voice was dead calm, but his eyes were locked on the horizon. "Where is it going?" Catherine grabbed the comms radio. "Command, what is the drone's heading?" "Ma'am, it's locked in a holding pattern loop, but the radius is degrading." The flight director's panicked voice echoed through the bunker. "It's caught in a powered descent. At its current trajectory and speed, it is going to impact the observation bunker in exactly 4 minutes. The color drained from General Hackett's face. "Evacuate the bunker, now!" But David knew it was too late. The bunker was at the center of the complex, surrounded by heavy chain-link fences and concrete barricades. To move 20 people out and into vehicles would take at least 10 minutes. A 10,000-pound drone hitting the bunker at 400 miles an hour, even with dummy payloads, would instantly obliterate the structure and everyone inside, sending shrapnel for a mile. David spun around, his eyes locking onto an AH-6 Little Bird helicopter sitting on a landing pad 100 yards behind the bunker. It was the chase chopper, used by the military observers to film the test from the air. "Larch!" David roared into the radio, terrifying the treacherous engineer in the command center. "Does the drone have a manual hardwire kill switch on the dorsal spine?" Yes!" Larch stammered, terrified of the disaster he had caused. "Under the service panel." "But you have to physically pull the primary avionics breaker." David didn't wait. He sprinted for the heavy steel door of the bunker. "David, where are you going?" Catherine screamed, terror ripping through her chest. She chased after him, ignoring the shouting generals. David burst out into the desert wind, sprinting toward the AH-6 Little Bird. Catherine was right behind him, her heels discarded, running barefoot across the concrete. "Get back in the bunker, Catherine! Get to the reinforced basement!" David yelled over his shoulder as he reached the small, agile helicopter. "No!" Catherine screamed, grabbing his arm as he opened the pilot's door. "I am not hiding while you die." "What are you doing?" "I'm going to intercept it," David said, his eyes blazing with a feral, terrifying focus. He jumped it into the right seat, furiously flipping switches. "I need someone in the left seat to hold the cyclic steady while I climb out onto the skids to pull the breaker. I can't do both." "I'll do it," Catherine said, instantly climbing into the left seat, slamming the door shut. "You don't know how to fly." "Then you have exactly 30 seconds to teach me!" Catherine yelled back, strapping on the 4-point harness, her eyes burning with titanium resolve. David looked at her. In the face of imminent death, she wasn't panicking. She was a warrior. He threw her a headset. "Put this on, battery on, fuel pumps on. We're skipping the warm-up." The AH-6 Little Bird, a lightweight, highly maneuverable special operations helicopter, screamed off the tarmac just as the MQ Next drone appeared as a terrifying black dot on the horizon, trailing a faint line of exhaust. 3 minutes to impact, the command center relayed over the radio. David banked the Little Bird violently, pushing the turbine engine past its redline limits. The G-force slammed Catherine into her seat, stealing her breath. She gripped the edge of the seat, her knuckles white, watching as David operated the machine. Not like a pilot, but like the helicopter was an extension of his own nervous system. "Listen to me, Catherine!" David shouted over the deafening roar of the rotors. "I am going to pull up directly above and slightly behind the drone. We will be flying at maximum airspeed. When I say, take it, you are going to grab that stick between your legs, the cyclic. Do not jerk it. Do not push it. Just hold it perfectly, dead still. If you flinch, we clip the drone's tail fin, and we both die. Do you understand? Hold it dead still. I understand, Catherine said, her voice shaking, but her hands reaching out to hover over the controls. The black dot of the drone rapidly expanded into a massive, terrifying wall of gray composite metal. It was screaming toward the bunker facility. David pushed the cyclic forward, diving the little bird to match the drone's altitude and speed. The turbulence was catastrophic. The wake vortex from the drone's jet engine battered the tiny helicopter, violently tossing it side to side. Alarms blared in the cockpit. "Warning! Overspeed!" the automated voice screamed. David ignored it. He expertly danced on the anti-torque pedals, stabilizing the shuddering helicopter directly above the speeding drone. They were flying at 160 knots, merely 10 feet above the runaway missile. David unbuckled his 4-point harness. He threw open the right side door. The wind tore into the cockpit, a hurricane-force blast that made it impossible to hear anything but the roar of the air. "Take it!" David roared. Catherine grabbed the cyclic stick with both hands. She felt the violent, vibrating life of the machine fighting against her. She locked her arms, her jaw clenched, staring straight ahead at the horizon, refusing to let the stick drift even a millimeter. David climbed out of the cockpit, stepping onto the thin metal landing skid. The wind threatened to rip him off the machine and hurl him into the desert below. He looked down. The dorsal spine of the MQ Next was just 5 feet below him. He didn't hesitate. Trusting Catherine entirely with his life, David dropped off the skid of the little bird. He slammed onto the smooth, curved top of the drone, his boots skidding across the composite material. He grabbed the edge of a recessed exhaust vent, his muscles screaming as the wind tried to tear him away. Above him, Catherine was holding the little bird, perfectly steady, a guardian angel made of titanium and grit. "Command! 1 minute to impact!" the radio screamed in Catherine's headset. The bunker compound was rushing toward them at terrifying speed. David crawled forward, ignoring the searing heat radiating from the drone's engine. He found the dorsal service panel. He smashed his fist into the release latch. The metal panel flew off, whipping past his face, revealing a complex mess of wiring in the primary avionics breaker box. He reached in, his fingers wrapping around the thick red release handle. He looked up at the observation bunker. He could see the tiny figures of the generals scrambling outside the compound. "Die!" David snarled, and he ripped the breaker entirely out of its housing. Instantly, the deafening roar of the drone's jet engine died. The machine went completely dark. Without propulsion and avionics, the heavy drone immediately lost its aerodynamic lift. It pitched violently downward. David pushed off the falling drone with all his strength, reaching upward into the sky. Above him, Catherine had anticipated the drop. She pushed the collective lever down, dipping the little bird's skid just enough. David's hand caught the metal skid. His shoulder popped with agonizing force as his entire body weight jerked against his socket, suspended thousands of feet in the air. Below them, the dead MQ Next drone slammed into the desert floor, half a mile short of the observation bunker. The impact was catastrophic, sending a massive plume of fire, dirt, and shredded composite material hundreds of feet into the air. The shock wave rattled the little bird. But they were safe. Catherine engaged the autopilot altitude hold, reached over, and grabbed David by the collar of his shirt, screaming with the effort as she hauled him back into the cockpit. He collapsed onto the floorboards, gasping for air, his right arm hanging limp. Catherine threw the helicopter into a sweeping, slow bank away from the crash site. She looked down at David. Her face was streaked with sweat, tears, and desert dust. David dragged himself up, slumping into the right seat. He looked at her, panting heavily. "You didn't flinch." Catherine let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. She hit the comms button. Command, this is CEO Hale. Threat neutralized. Send emergency medical to the tarmac. We are coming home. She ripped off her headset, ignoring the frantic cheering erupting from the radio. She unbuckled her harness, leaned across the center console, grabbed David by the face, and kissed him. It was a kiss, born of pure adrenaline, terror, and an overwhelming, undeniable love. David kissed her back with equal ferocity, his good arm pulling her tight against him, anchoring her in the chaotic sky. 3 hours later, the dust had settled. FBI agent Reed, flanked by military police, dragged Derek Larch out of the command center in handcuffs. Larch had broken in 10 minutes, sobbing and handing over the Cayman Island bank routing numbers that traced directly back to Bradley Stanton's private accounts. By nightfall, federal agents were raiding Stanton Capital's headquarters in Seattle, arresting Bradley on charges of corporate terrorism, attempted murder, and treason. The MQ-Nex contract was signed by General Hackett on the hood of a Humvee before he even left the base. Later that evening, inside the quiet sanctuary of the penthouse, David stood by the massive floor-to-ceiling window, his arm heavily bandaged and secured in a sling. He was looking out at the city lights, the same lights he had flown into on that chaotic night months ago. He heard the soft padding of bare feet. Catherine wrapped her arms around his waist from behind, resting her cheek against his good shoulder. "Chloe is asleep," Catherine murmured softly. "She wanted to know if you fought a dragon today." "I told her you did, and you won." David smiled, turning around to face her. He looked down at the brilliant, beautiful woman who had gambled her empire on a janitor. "Catherine," David said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "The contract we signed, the 18 months, I want to breach it." Catherine looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the city lights. "You want out!" David reached into his pocket with his good hand. He pulled out a simple, elegant diamond ring, not bought with corporate funds, but with his very first paycheck as her executive consultant. "No," David said, dropping to one knee, looking up into the eyes of the titanium heiress who had saved his daughter's life. "I want to tear it up, and I want to do this for real." Catherine's breath caught. The tears she had held back all day finally spilled over. She didn't hesitate. She didn't need to consult a board. "Yes," she whispered, pulling him back up into her arms. "Yes, always." Did you love this heart-pounding story of a desperate father and a titanium CEO taking on the corporate underworld? If David and Catherine's incredible journey from a fake arrangement to a deeply real romance kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button right now. Don't forget to share this video with your friends who love high-stakes drama, military twists, and epic love stories. Want more intense original stories like this every single week? Smash that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. See you in the next one.